June 10th, 1944, Normandy, France, 3 days after D-Day. The air was heavy with smoke and cordite, the earth trembling beneath the weight of engines. Somewhere in the hedgerows near the village of Saint-Pierre, a small group of British infantrymen crouched in the mud, rifles clutched tight, listening to the low growl that everyone feared: tanks. The Germans were counterattacking, not just with any tanks, but with the beasts of legend, the Panzer IVs and Panthers of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. Hardened, angry young soldiers with years of training and a taste for revenge. They'd been told the British were weak, that their infantry would scatter the moment they saw the black crosses rolling toward them. They were wrong. Private Thomas "Tommy" Ashford wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted through the smoke. He was 22, from Manchester, and had never faced a tank before. His sergeant, George Harper, crouched beside him, whispering, "They'll come down that road. Don't fire till I say." Behind them, lying in the mud under a camouflage net, was their secret. A strange, bulky weapon with a long steel tube and a crude spring mechanism. The Piat, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. A weapon so heavy and awkward that soldiers joked it could kill a man just by dropping it on his foot. But when used right, it could do the unthinkable: stop a tank dead. The men called it the Beast. It kicked like a mule, jammed half the time, and weighed nearly 35 pounds. But right now, it was all that stood between them and a column of German armor. From the distance came the first sound, the metallic rumble of treads grinding over the stones. The panzers were coming. Across the fields, villagers ran for cover, clutching what little they had left. The British artillery was silent. Communications had broken down after a night of chaos. It was just these 30 men, infantry with rifles, Bren guns, and one Piat. The first Panzer appeared through the smoke, its gray hull smeared with mud, the black cross gleaming faintly in the dim morning light. Its turret swung slowly, the long barrel searching for targets. Behind it came 2 more, then 5, then 8. The German commander, inside his lead tank, Oberfeldwebel Kurt Müller, laughed through his headset. "British infantry, they'll run, as always." He ordered his driver forward, confident, the steel beast pushing through hedgerows like paper. But the British didn't move. They waited in the hedgerows, hearts pounding, fingers on triggers. Sergeant Harper whispered, "Steady, lads, let them come close." Tommy swallowed hard, gripping the Piat's handle. He'd trained with it once, on a quiet field back in Dorset. The instructor had said, "You'll know if you've done it right. You'll still be alive." That memory didn't help much now. The Panzer was close enough that Tommy could see the commander's head poking from the hatch, goggles glinting. Harper raised his hand, then dropped it. Now. Tommy squeezed the trigger. The Piat roared like thunder. The spring-loaded bomb shot out, leaving a puff of smoke and dirt. For a second, nothing. Then a flash. The warhead hit squarely on the Panzer turret ring, and the tank stopped. Smoke began to pour out. The crew inside screamed as fire licked out from the hatch. The second tank halted, confused, its gun traversing wildly. The British opened up with Bren guns, bullets bouncing off armor but keeping the crew inside blind and panicked. Another Piat round flew, fired by Corporal Davies from the other side of the lane. It struck the second tank near the tracks, and with a deafening clang, the tread blew apart. The Panzer lurched sideways, immobilized. The German formation faltered. Inside his tank, Müller shouted in disbelief, "Infantry with anti-tank weapons! Engage them!" The coaxial MG-34 opened up, cutting through branches and dirt, but the British had already moved positions, crawling like shadows through the hedgerows. A mortar round landed near the third tank. The explosion sent shrapnel through its side skirts. The Germans realized too late that they had walked into a trap, a small unit with the courage of a full battalion. By noon, smoke covered the fields. 5 tanks lay wrecked or burning. The survivors retreated behind a ridge, their crews shaken. Sergeant Harper's section had lost 3 men. Tommy sat beside the Piat, his shoulder bruised and his ears ringing, but alive. He looked at the smoking wreck ahead and muttered, "Bloody hell, it worked." Later, as the survivors regrouped, Harper walked over, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. He said quietly, "They thought we'd run. Well, we ran straight at them." That night, word spread through the division. British infantry had taken out German tanks using those clumsy Piats. Other platoons began digging them out, practicing, learning. The myth that tanks were invincible started to crack. For the Germans, it was an insult. Reports reached Panzer headquarters that British foot soldiers had destroyed armor in open country. Some officers refused to believe it. Others called it luck. But those who'd been there, those who'd watched their tanks burn from a distance, knew it wasn't luck. It was determination, grit, and a strange weapon that turned the battlefield upside down. By the time dusk fell, the fields around St. Pierre were littered with the wrecks of steel and bodies. The air stank of oil and cordite. But the British lines held. Tommy wrote in his small notebook before falling asleep that night. They said we'd run. We didn't. We stood. The next morning, German scouts returned to recover what they could. They found the blackened lamaines of their panzers, one with a Piat bomb still embedded in the armor. Inside the tank, the crew was gone. On the ground nearby, they found a broken Piat, its spring twisted, its paint scorched. Someone had tried to reload it and kept firing until it cracked apart. The German officer who surveyed the scene shook his head. "Madmen," he said softly. "British madmen." What he didn't know was that across the front, hundreds of other British soldiers were doing the same thing, standing their ground, waiting for the moment to pull the trigger. And soon the panzers would learn that the enemy they'd mocked as weak and soft had found a new kind of courage, one forged in mud, fear, and the recoil of a weapon no one believed in until it worked. June 11th, 1944. The dawn came slowly, burning through a haze of smoke that hung over the hedgerows. The smell of oil and scorched steel lingered in the air like a curse. British infantry of the 6th Durham Light Infantry had spent the night digging in, rearming, and counting the cost. 5 tanks destroyed, 3 men lost, but they were still holding the line. And now the Germans were coming again.
Reports crackled over the wireless. Panzer counterattack forming, multiple armored units, direction Caen to St. Pierre. The British soldiers looked at one another in silence. They knew what that meant. More tanks, more death. Private Thomas Ashford sat in the mud with his PAIT laid across his knees. The weapon was filthy, its metal slick with grime, but he'd already cleaned it twice, like a ritual. Sergeant George Harper crouched beside him, unshaven and hollow-eyed, staring toward the tree line where the morning mist hid everything. "They'll come again," Harper muttered, voice low. "And this time they'll be angry." He was right. On the other side of the ridge, the 12th SS Panzer Division was regrouping. Tank crews worked through the night repairing damaged vehicles, cursing the British with every turn of the wrench. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Müller sat on the hull of his replacement Panzer IV, smoking a cigarette. His last crew was dead, burned alive when the tank went up. He'd barely escaped. "Infantry," he said bitterly to his loader. British peasants with spring guns. You believe that?" The loader shook his head. It was luck, but Mueller wasn't sure. He'd seen the precision, the timing. The ambush hadn't been random. The British had waited, planned, and struck at the perfect moment. It wasn't luck. It was nerve. And that made them dangerous. By 0900 hours, the Germans moved out again. 10 tanks, supported by armored half-tracks and infantry. Their objective was simple: retake St. Pierre and push the British back toward the beaches. The British were ready. Harper's platoon was spread out along a hedgerow overlooking a narrow road flanked by apple orchards. It was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of insects and the occasional bird startled by artillery, far off toward Caen. Then came the first sound, a deep, rhythmic rumbling, like thunder. The men froze. "They're coming," whispered Corporal Davies. The panzers appeared in the distance, sunlight glinting off their armor, 10 of them moving in a line, guns scanning, commanders standing in their hatches. Behind them marched infantry in gray, rifles slung, confident. Harper looked down the line at his men. No one fires till they're in the killing zone. The tanks rolled closer, 800 yards, 600, 400. The ground vibrated, dirt trickled from the walls of their trenches. Tommy gripped the PAIT tighter, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his fingertips. He whispered a small prayer he didn't believe in. Then Harper gave the signal. The world exploded. A PAIT fired from the right flank, a white streak, then a thunderous blast as the lead Panzer's side armor shattered. Fire and smoke erupted. The tank stopped, crew bailing out only to be cut down by Bren fire. Another PAIT launched from the left, striking a second Panzer's treads, tearing them apart. The tank veered into a ditch, helpless. German machine guns opened up, spraying the hedges with fire. Dirt and leaves flew everywhere. Men hugged the ground as bullets snapped overhead. Tommy reloaded the PAIT, fumbling with the heavy spring. It jammed. "Bloody thing," he cursed, slamming the lever until it clicked. He aimed again, his shoulder bruised from the last shot, and fired. The bomb arced across the field and struck a half-track square in the nose. It exploded in a flash of orange. German infantry dove for cover. For a moment, chaos reigned. Then came the sound of British mortars thudding from behind the ridge. Explosions tore through the advancing Germans, forcing them to scatter. Harper shouted over the din, "Hold your ground! Don't let them flank us!" A Panzer rolled forward, its turret turning toward Harper's position. The gun fired, a direct hit on the hedge. Dirt and splinters filled the air. 2 men went down instantly. Tommy blinked through the dust, ears ringing. The Panzer was barely 80 yards away now, its barrel swinging toward him. He grabbed the PAIT, loaded another bomb, and aimed straight at the monster. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, knocking him flat. The bomb flew true, hitting just below the turret. There was a sharp crack. Then the tank stopped. The turret lifted slightly, as if the whole thing took a breath. Then it erupted. Flames shot out of the hatches. Tommy lay there, gasping, his ears full of static. Harper crawled over, slapped his helmet, and grinned. "You mad bastard, you got it!" The battle raged for another hour. By the time it ended, 5 Panzers lay smoking in the fields. The rest retreated once more, leaving behind shattered armor and broken pride. When the shooting stopped, the silence was deafening. The men didn't cheer. They just sat there, exhausted, too numb to feel victory. Later that evening, Harper stood with Tommy by one of the destroyed tanks. The heat still rose from the blackened hull. The smell of burned fuel hung thick. "You realize what this means, lad?" Harper said quietly. "Those bastards thought we'd run from them. Now they're the ones running." Tommy looked at the wreck and nodded slowly. "Reckon they'll think twice next time." Word spread again. British infantry had faced Panzers head-on and won. Commanders sent messages of praise up the chain. Field Marshal Montgomery would later call the use of PAITs one of the great leveling moments of infantry warfare. But for the men who fought, it wasn't about glory. It was about survival. The PAIT was no wonder weapon. It was brutal, primitive, and unreliable. The spring was so stiff it took 2 men to cock it sometimes. Misfires were common, and its range was pitiful. You had to let the tank get close, terrifyingly close. And yet, somehow, it worked. In German field reports, captured documents later revealed the growing frustration. One commander wrote, "The British infantry no longer fears armor. They attack tanks like hunters. Their weapon, though crude, is effective. We have underestimated them." That single line told the truth. The days of British soldiers being overrun by tanks were gone. The PAIT had given them teeth. That night, Tommy and the remaining men of his platoon sat around a small fire, smoking in silence. The night sky was clear for the first time in days. Stars glittered over the black silhouettes of burned tanks. Corporal Davy spoke softly. "Funny, isn't it? We spent years afraid of these things. Now look at 'em." Harper exhaled smoke.
"Fear cuts both ways, lad. They had theirs today." Somewhere out there, the German survivors regrouped again. Müller sat inside his replacement tank, staring at the reflection of flames in the distance. He had lost too many men in 2 days. His pride was gone, replaced by something colder, respect. "The Germans don't run anymore," he muttered. "They wait." By midnight, the front was quiet. The crickets returned, and the guns fell silent. In the calm, Tommy lay on his back in the grass, the Piot resting beside him like an old dog. His shoulder ached, his ears rang, but he smiled faintly. For the first time since the invasion, he believed they might actually win. The Panzers would come again, everyone knew that. But when they did, they wouldn't be facing frightened infantrymen anymore. They'd be facing men who had learned to fight fire with fire. And in that muddy French field, among the smoke and the ruins, the legend of the Piot was born. June 16th, 1944, 5 days after St. Pierre. The rain had turned the Normandy fields into a sea of mud. Tanks bogged down, boots sank deep, and the stench of death and diesel hung in the air. The British 43rd Wessex Division had been ordered to take Hill 112, a rise of land south of Caen that looked unremarkable on a map, but dominated the entire front. Whoever held it could see for miles, direct artillery, and control the road to the city. For the Germans, losing it meant opening the way to the heart of Normandy. For the British, taking it meant paying a price in blood. Private Thomas Ashford stood in the drizzle, watching the gray outline of the hill through the mist. He'd survived St. Pierre, survived the counterattack, but this was different. This wasn't an ambush, this was open war. Panzers, mortars, machine guns, all waiting for them up there. Beside him, Sergeant Harper adjusted his helmet and spat into the mud. "You ready, lad?" Tommy nodded, though his hand shook slightly as he loaded another Piot bomb into the tube. "As I'll ever be." "Good, because they'll be waiting." Harper looked down the line of men crouched behind the hedge, exhausted, soaked, faces gray with fatigue. "Remember what we've done before. Those tanks bleed like anything else, just have to get close enough to make 'em feel it." Close enough. Those words always carried weight. The Piot's range was barely 100 yards on a good day. To use it, you had to let the tank come close enough that you could see the bolts on its armor, close enough to hear the crew shouting inside. At 0600 hours, the order came. The assault began. Artillery screamed overhead, pounding the ridge. The ground trembled. The British advanced through fields of tall wheat flattened by rain. Shells burst around them, spraying dirt and shrapnel. Ahead, the German lines erupted with machine gun fire. The 10th SS Panzer Division was dug in deep, and they were ready. Tommy's section moved along a sunken lane bordered by hedgerows. Bullets cracked overhead, leaves flying like shrapnel. Mortar rounds thudded into the fields. Harper shouted, "Down! Stay low!" A shell landed close, flinging mud and men into the air. Tommy hit the ground, ears ringing. When he looked up, Corporal Davies was gone, just a crater where he'd been. Harper crawled over, face streaked with blood. "We keep moving! Move!" They crawled, stumbled, ran, anything to close the distance. Through the smoke, they saw them, 3 Panzers moving up the slope, their turrets scanning. Infantry followed, dark shapes moving like ghosts in the mist. "Piat team, up front!" Harper called. Tommy dropped into a ditch, mud up to his chest, and set up the launcher on the edge. He wiped the scope, though it barely helped in the rain. The first Panzer was only 150 yards away now, rumbling forward, crushing everything in its path. "Wait for it!" Harper's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Wait!" Tommy's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his throat. The Panzer's barrel turned toward them. "Now!" He fired. The Piat's spring exploded backwards, slamming into his shoulder. The bomb flew, wobbling slightly, and then hit just above the tank's tread. A flash, then smoke. The Panzer lurched to a halt, its engine coughing. "Hit! Reload!" Harper yelled. Tommy fumbled for another bomb, his hand shaking. The second Panzer opened fire, the shell blasting a tree into splinters. He ducked instinctively as wood and dirt rained down. He loaded, aimed, fired again. This one missed, slamming into the ground short of the target. The explosion sent mud flying. "Adjust! 20 yards right!" Harper barked. He reloaded, again, the motion mechanical now, fueled by adrenaline. The next shot found its mark, striking the Panzer turret ring. Flames burst from the hatch. The gunner inside tried to climb out, but didn't make it. A cheer went up from somewhere behind them. The British line was moving again, pushing forward. But the Germans weren't done. 2 more Panzers appeared over the crest, supported by infantry carrying MG-42s. Their gunfire tore through the wheat, cutting men down. A Bren gun answered, the chatter echoing in the mist. Tommy ducked back behind the hedge, breathing hard. "We'll run out of bombs soon." Harper nodded grimly. "Then we'll use what's left. Grenades, rifles, stones if we have to. We hold here till the others get through." They held. Hour after hour, the battle raged up and down Hill 112. Artillery churned the earth into a nightmare of craters and corpses. Tanks burned, men screamed, medics dragged the wounded through mud that swallowed their boots. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of cordite. By midnight, the British had gained barely a few hundred yards. Every advance cost lives. Every hedgerow hit another machine gun or sniper. In the chaos, Tommy found himself alone at one point, separated from his section. The Piat was jammed, its spring refusing to cock. He pounded it against the ground, teeth clenched, muttering curses. Then he heard it, the unmistakable grind of treads behind him. He turned. A Panzer was coming down the lane, alone, hunting. He ducked behind a stone wall, reloading as fast as he could. The tank rolled closer, crushing debris under its weight. He could see the gunner in the turret scanning. If he waited a second too long, he'd be gone. He aimed through the Piat's tiny sight, mud dripping down his face, and squeezed the trigger.
The spring snapped. The bomb shot out, slammed into the tank's lower front plate. For a moment, nothing. Then, bang! The explosion punched through the armor. The Panzer stopped, smoke pouring out. The hatch opened. A German climbed halfway out, coughing, covered in soot. Tommy raised his rifle and fired once. The man fell back inside. The silence that followed was surreal. No one moved. No shouting, no gunfire, just rain and distant thunder. Then, slowly, Tommy climbed out of the ditch, legs trembling, and walked past the burning wreck. The tank hissed as rain hit the flames. He looked up the hill and saw more British infantry pushing forward, their bayonets glinting through the smoke. They were still moving, still fighting. By late afternoon, the British had reached the crest. The fighting turned savage, hand to hand in the trenches, grenades thrown at point-blank range. Harper's section, what was left of it, joined the push. They moved through shattered trees and smoking holes that had once been foxholes. Harper caught sight of Tommy, dragging the Piat through the mud. "Still carrying that bloody thing?" Tommy grinned weakly. "It's lucky." A shell landed nearby, flinging both of them to the ground. When Tommy looked up, his ears were ringing. Harper was lying still. Blood trickled from under his helmet. Tommy crawled over, shouting, "Sarge! Sarge!" Harper's eyes flickered open. He gripped Tommy's sleeve weakly. "You hold this hill, lad. Don't let them take it back." His voice broke into a cough. "Tell them we didn't run." Then his hand went limp. Tommy sat there in the mud for a long moment, staring at the lifeless face of the man who'd led him through hell. Then he picked up the Piat and moved forward. By evening, the Germans launched one last desperate counterattack. Panthers, Tigers, and Panzers all rolling toward the crest under a storm of smoke. British artillery fired until the barrels glowed red, but still they came. Tommy and the remnants of his platoon crouched behind the ridge, every man armed with whatever they had left, rifles, grenades, Piats. The tanks loomed larger, closer. He loaded his last bomb. Rain dripped from his helmet into his eyes. He could barely see through the smoke, but he aimed anyway. The nearest tank fired. The shell whistled past, missing by feet. The blast threw dirt over him. He steadied the Piat, held his breath, and pulled the trigger. The weapon kicked, the bomb flew, and struck the Tiger square on the side. It didn't penetrate, but it stunned the crew. British artillery pounced, dropping shells onto the immobilized tank until it vanished in a fireball. One by one, the remaining German tanks fell back. They had come expecting another easy rout, terrified men running from steel monsters. Instead, they found infantry who refused to move, who faced them with crude weapons and unbreakable will. By midnight, Hill 112 was in British hands, barely. Out of the hundreds who'd started up that slope, fewer than half were standing. The ground was littered with the wrecks of tanks and the dead of both sides. The hill was theirs, but the cost was written in blood. At dawn, Tommy sat alone on the crest, the Piat lying beside him, bent and useless. His uniform was caked in mud, his hands raw, his face streaked with soot. He looked out over the fields below, smoking ruins, dead tanks, and the faint glimmer of the Orne River in the distance. He thought of Harper, of Davies, of the others who didn't make it. And he thought of the Germans who'd come so sure of victory, now scattered and broken. Later, when the official report was written, it would read simply, "Enemy counterattack repelled, objectives secured." But those words didn't tell the story. They didn't tell of the fear, or the courage, or the sheer madness it took for men to stare down a tank with nothing but a spring-loaded pipe and a bomb the size of a milk bottle. Weeks later, when the British pushed further south, Hill 112 remained a graveyard. The wrecks were never cleared. The burned-out hulls left as silent witnesses. German prisoners were marched past it, heads lowered, eyes averted. Some whispered, "They didn't run." In the years after the war, historians would argue about tactics and weapons, whether the Piat was truly effective, whether the infantry's bravery outweighed the weapon's flaws. But the men who were there never questioned it. They'd seen what courage and a bit of steel could do. In 1945, when the war finally ended, Tommy Ashford returned home to Manchester. He carried nothing but a small photograph of his platoon and a medal he never asked for. Sometimes, on rainy nights, he'd wake up to the sound of thunder and think it was tanks again. And in his dreams, he'd see Harper standing on that hill, cigarette in hand, saying, "They'll come again, lad. Be ready." He lived a quiet life after that, working in a factory, raising a family. He never spoke much about Normandy, except once to his son, who asked, "Dad, were you scared?" Tommy smiled faintly and said, "Aye, every man was, but the trick was not to show it." When he died in 1989, his medals were found in a small box, next to a tiny metal plate, warped and blackened from a Piat bomb. Someone had scratched into it, in shaky letters, "We didn't run." The Germans expected British infantry to break before their tanks, to flee before the steel and the thunder. Instead, they found infantry who refused to move, who faced them with crude weapons and unbreakable will. And somewhere on that quiet hill in Normandy, if the wind blows just right, you can almost hear it. The click of a Piat's spring, the heartbeat of men who refuse to give way, and the echo of history whispering back, "They stood."